In the late 1950s, the world fell in love with a sound so pure it felt celestial. The intertwined voices of the Browns. Their defining hit, The Three Bells, was more than a song. It was a miniature epic that transcended genre, reaching the top of both the country and pop charts while also becoming a rare top 10 hit on the R&B chart and launching three siblings from rural Arkansas into global stardom. But the heart of that sound, the grounding force and quiet engine of the group, was the eldest sister, Maxine Brown. This is not just the story of that beautiful music, it is the story of the devastating silence that followed. When her younger siblings chose to walk away from fame in pursuit of different dreams, a quiet family life for one, a soaring solo career for the other, Maxine was left behind. For the woman who had nurtured the dream since childhood, the end of the group wasn't a graceful exit, it was a profound abandonment. This is the story of her incredible resilience, the unglamorous strength required to watch the world you built crumble, and the journey to find a new voice and purpose long after the microphones were switched off. To truly understand Maxine and the unique ethereal sound she would help create, you must transport yourself back to a place and time that now feels like a distant myth. It isn't enough to say she was born in the Depression-era South. You have to feel the grit of it, the texture of the poverty, and the overwhelming power of the landscape that shaped her. Imagine rural Arkansas in the 1930s. This was not the romanticized South of fiction. This was a land of dense pine forests, red clay soil, and a humidity so thick it felt like a heavy blanket in the summer. It was a place governed by the rhythms of the sun, the seasons, and the constant grinding struggle for survival. Maxine was born on April 27, 1931, in the small sawmill town of Campty, Louisiana, but her soul was forged in the timberlands around Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Her father, Floyd Brown, was a logger. This wasn't a job, it was a battle. He was a strong, hard-bitten man who spent his days wrestling with giants, felling the massive pine trees that were the region's primary currency. The work was perilous, the days were long, and the pay was pitifully small. Every morning he left for the logging camp, there was no guarantee he would come home in one piece. This constant, low-level anxiety was a part of the family's daily bread. Her mother, Bertie, was the quiet, unshakable center of their world. In an era where women's roles were rigidly defined, Bertie was a master of the domestic arts out of sheer necessity. She could stretch $1 until it wept, turn a handful of garden vegetables into a meal for a family of 5, and mend clothes until the patches had patches of their own. She was the family's nurse, teacher, and spiritual guide. She was resourceful, resilient, and the unwavering emotional core that held the fragile structure of their lives together. The Brown family home was not a house in the modern sense. It was a simple, unpainted wooden shack, often with no electricity or indoor plumbing. Light came from kerosene lamps that cast flickering, dancing shadows on the walls at night. Water was drawn from a well, hand-pumped and carried inside in buckets. Heat in the winter came from a wood-burning stove that was the heart of the home, a place for cooking, for warmth, and for gathering. In a world utterly devoid of modern distractions, no television, no telephone, no endless stream of digital noise, the family's focus was turned inward on each other. In this environment of scarcity, the Browns possessed a deep, abiding richness in two things: familial love and music. Music wasn't a luxury or a hobby. It was as essential as air and water. It was their entertainment on long, dark evenings when there was no money for a trip to the picture show. It was their solace when a drought withered the vegetable garden or a logging accident laid up their father, plunging the family into even deeper financial peril. It was their form of prayer, their way of connecting to something divine when they gathered on the sagging front porch in the humid twilight. The family's portal to the outside world was a large, battery-powered wooden radio. It was a magical box that, with the turn of a dial, could fill their small home with voices from a distant universe. On Saturday nights, they would huddle around it, the static crackling like a small fire, and listen to the broadcast of the Grand Ole Opry from WSM in Nashville. The sounds of Roy Acuff, the king of country music, and the haunting traditional ballads of the Carter family would drift through the Arkansas pines. For the Brown children, these weren't just singers, they were prophets and storytellers, their songs painting vivid pictures of a world of romance, adventure, and heartbreak that lay far beyond their own limited horizons. This music seeped into the very marrow of their bones. Their father, Floyd, for all his toughness, had a musician's soul. He possessed a fine, clear singing voice and played the fiddle, coaxing mournful, joyful tunes from the instrument he held so gently. He taught his children the old gospel hymns that had been passed down through generations, songs of redemption, faith, and the promise of a better life beyond the veil of earthly struggle. Bertie, their mother, played the guitar with a simple, steady rhythm, providing the foundation for the family's impromptu concerts. It was in this fertile, music-soaked soil that Maxine, the eldest, discovered her life's calling. She was a quiet, observant child, and she absorbed everything. She watched her father's fingers on the fiddle, her mother's hands on the guitar frets. She listened not just to the melodies, but to the spaces between the notes. She developed an intuitive understanding of harmony, of how different vocal lines could intertwine to create a sound far more powerful and beautiful than any single voice alone. As her siblings, Jim Ed, born in 1934, and Bonnie, born in 1937, grew old enough to sing, the family home became a laboratory of sound. Their harmonizing began as a natural, almost unconscious act. It wasn't taught, it was felt. On the front porch, with the chorus of cicadas as their orchestra, they would start to sing. Maxine, with her solid, nurturing presence and her natural alto voice, would instinctively take the middle harmony, the glue that held everything together. Jim Ed, with his warm, resonant baritone, would find the root of the chord, providing a solid melodic foundation. And little Bonnie, with her angelic, effortlessly high soprano, would float over the top of them, adding a layer of ethereal beauty, the final perfect brushstroke on a masterpiece. Maxine would later recall the simplicity and purity of those moments. We didn't have electricity. We didn't have running water. We didn't have a whole lot of anything, but we had a guitar and we had each other. This simple statement holds the key to their entire career. Theirs was a sound born not of ambition, but of intimacy. They learned to sing together in the same way they learned to walk and talk. It was a fundamental part of their shared existence. They learned to breathe in unison, to anticipate each other's phrasing, to feel the subtle shifts in pitch and tone without a word being spoken. Their voices weren't just singing notes, they were having a conversation, weaving themselves together into a single, seamless entity. This intuitive, familial blend would become their non-negotiable trademark, a sound so pure and otherworldly that it felt like it emanated from a single, celestial source. The brutal reality of their childhood cannot be overstated. The Great Depression was not an abstract economic concept. It was the empty pantry, the worn-out shoes, the constant worry etched on their parents' faces. This hardship forged in the Brown siblings a powerful, unshakable work ethic and a profound sense of gratitude for any small blessing that came their way. Music, in the beginning wasn't about a desire for fame or fortune. Such concepts were as alien as the surface of the moon. It was about connection, expression, and, very quickly, about survival. As Maxine and Jim Ed entered their teenage years, they realized their gift could be more than just a source of family entertainment. It could be a source of income. They began performing at local schoolhouses, community gatherings, and on the flatbeds of trucks at county fairs. Their first earnings weren't spent on frivolous things. They went directly into the family pot to help buy groceries or medicine. This ingrained in Maxine especially a sense of responsibility. She wasn't just a singer, she was a provider. She was the protector not only of her younger siblings, but of the family's fragile financial security. This upbringing created a sound that was, above all else, authentic. It was rooted in the red clay of their home state. When they sang songs of heartache and loss, they did so with the inherited memory of real, lean times and genuine struggle. When they sang the old gospel hymns, it was with the deep, unshakable conviction of a family that had relied on faith as their only shield against a harsh and unforgiving world. As the oldest, Maxine shouldered the emotional and practical weight of their burgeoning talent. She was the one who saw the path forward, the one who believed that their front porch harmonies could be their ticket to a better life. It was her dream, her vision, that propelled them forward. She was the steadfast keeper of their unique, beautiful sound, the sister who held the harmony in place. It was a role she would embrace with every fiber of her being, long before the wider world would ever come to know their names, and a role she would find impossible to relinquish, even long after the sound itself had faded into silence. The harmony born on that dusty Arkansas porch was pure and instinctual, a private language of love and survival. But as the children grew and the realities of their family's poverty remained, that beautiful sound could no longer stay a secret. For Maxine, the pragmatist and the dreamer, the time had come to carry their music beyond the pine forests, to see if the notes that had comforted their family could pave a road out of hardship and toward a life they had only heard about on the radio. The journey from the front porch to a professional stage is rarely a single leap. For Maxine and Jim Ed Brown, it was a series of small, determined steps taken on a path paved with hope and the constant, nagging uncertainty of their financial situation. The transition from singing for supper to singing for a career began in the late 1940s, as Maxine was finishing high school. She was the pragmatist, the one who saw their harmonious gift not just as a blessing, but as a potential commodity in a world that had offered their family few other resources. Jim Ed, younger and more introverted, was blessed with a voice as warm and smooth as polished hickory, but it was Maxine who possessed the vision and the grit. She became their de facto manager, booking agent, and promoter. Armed with a telephone and a stubborn refusal to take no for an answer, she began calling local grange halls, school auditoriums, and community centers, asking for a spot on their entertainment bill. Their act was simple: Jim Edward and Maxine Brown. They would stand side by side, sharing a single microphone, their youthful faces earnest and open. Jim Ed would cradle his guitar, providing the steady rhythm, while Maxine stood beside him, her gaze fixed on some distant point, her voice locking into a perfect, intuitive harmony with her brother's lead. Their early repertoire was a mix of the gospel hymns their father had taught them, the popular country songs they heard on the radio, and a few tentative, heartfelt compositions of Maxine's own. The pay was often little more than a hot meal and a few dollars in gas money, but it was a start. Each performance was a lesson. They learned about stage presence, about reading an audience, and about the grueling reality of packing up their meager equipment at midnight to drive down a dark, unpaved Arkansas road to the next town. Their first significant break came not from a smoky honky-tonk, but from a local talent contest. It was the kind of small-town event that was a cornerstone of community life, a chance for local hopefuls to showcase their skills. Maxine, ever the opportunist, signed them up. Standing on a makeshift stage under bare light bulbs, they sang with the unaffected purity that had been their signature since childhood. They didn't win $1 million or a record contract, but they won something far more valuable, an opportunity. The prize was a regular performing spot on the Barnyard Frolic, a popular live radio show broadcast from the KLRA station in Little Rock. In the pre-television era of the early 1950s, live radio was the absolute epicenter of the country music world. It was the pipeline that carried the sounds of Nashville, Shreveport, and Chicago into homes across the nation. For a regional act, a regular spot on a show like the Barnyard Frolic was the equivalent of a primetime television slot today. It was a chance to build a loyal following, to become a familiar voice that families invited into their living rooms each week. The show was a whirlwind of organized chaos. It was broadcast live, which meant there were no second takes. The studio was often crowded with performers, announcers, and engineers, the air thick with the smell of coffee, tobacco, and nervous energy. For Maxine and Jim Ed, it was a crash course in professionalism. They had to be on time, prepared, and able to perform flawlessly under pressure. Maxine thrived in this environment. She watched, she listened, and she learned the mechanics of the business. She saw how the show's host engaged with the audience, how the commercials were woven into the broadcast, and how the more established acts carried themselves. It was during this time that Maxine's songwriting began to blossom. She had a gift for capturing simple, universal emotions in her lyrics. During this time, Maxine's songwriting began to blossom. Working with Jim Ed, she crafted a wistful tune about watching a lover walk away. The song, which they co-wrote, was called Looking Back to See. She played it for Jim Ed, and their voices fell into their familiar perfect harmony. The song had a quiet power, a gentle melancholy that felt instantly relatable. They performed it on the Barnyard Frolic, and the station switchboard lit up. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Listeners wanted to know who sang that song and where they could buy a copy. Seeing the potential, the station's owner helped them record a demo. The recording was rudimentary, made with basic equipment, but it captured the raw, honest beauty of their harmony. That simple demo found its way to a small independent label called Faber Records. In 1954, Looking Back to See was released as their first single. They had no expectations. To them, just having a record with their names on it was a victory. But then something incredible happened. The song started getting airplay, first in Little Rock, then across Arkansas, and then it began to spread. It was a slow burn, a true grassroots hit. It eventually climbed into the top 10 on the national country charts, an astonishing feat for two unknown teenagers from Pine Bluff on a tiny label. Suddenly, Jim Edward and Maxine Brown were no longer just local radio personalities. They were recording artists with a hit song. The success of Looking Back to See brought them to the attention of one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in the music industry, Faber Robeson. Robeson was the founder of Faber Records and Abbott Records, and more importantly, he was a key figure behind the Louisiana Hayride, the Shreveport-based radio show that was the primary rival to the Grand Ole Opry. The Hayride was known for its slightly more rebellious, rockabilly-infused style and had earned the nickname the Cradle of the Stars for launching the careers of giants like Hank Williams and, more recently, a young hip-swiveling sensation named Elvis Presley. Robison saw immense potential in the Browns' wholesome image and unique sound. He summoned them to Shreveport. For two kids who had rarely been out of Arkansas, meeting a big-time music impresario like Robison was both thrilling and terrifying. He was a fast talker, a charismatic visionary who painted a grand picture of their future. Hit records, national tours, and a spot on the legendary Louisiana Hayride. He offered them a management and recording contract. Overwhelmed and starstruck, they signed on the dotted line. It was a decision that would both make and nearly break their careers. The contract was a labyrinth of clauses and subclauses, a classic example of the kind of exploitative deals that were rampant in the industry at the time. It gave Robison almost total control over their careers, their recordings, and, most critically, their publishing rights. As the songwriter, Maxine had unknowingly signed away the ownership of her own creations, including Looking Back to See. They were young, naive, and lacked the legal counsel to understand the profound long-term implications of what they were doing. All they saw was the open door to their dreams. Life under Robison's management was a relentless grind. They became regulars on the Louisiana Hayride, sharing the stage with a mind-boggling array of future legends. One night they might be standing in the wings watching Johnny Cash perform with a feral intensity. The next they'd see George Jones, already a master vocalist, command the stage. They even crossed paths with Elvis before he became a global icon. Maxine later recalled him as a polite, shy young man who would sit quietly backstage, a world away from the supernova he was about to become. The Hayride was their university, but the touring circuit was their crucible. Robison booked them on endless package tours, crisscrossing the country in a crowded car, performing night after night in different towns for very little pay. They were living the dream, but they were exhausted, homesick, and perpetually broke. Robison controlled all the money, and their share, after his commissions and expenses, was often a pittance. It was a harsh but invaluable education in the predatory nature of the music business. In 1955, a pivotal event occurred that would transform their act forever. Their younger sister Bonnie graduated from high school. She had been watching her siblings rise with a mixture of pride and longing. She possessed the same innate musicality, and her bright, crystalline soprano was the missing ingredient they never knew they needed. She joined the act, and in that moment, Jim Edward and Maxine Brown ceased to exist. They were now simply the Browns. The addition of Bonnie's voice was a revelation. It completed the sonic triangle, allowing them to create complex three-part harmonies that were breathtaking in their precision and beauty. Maxine's solid alto was the earth, Jim Ed's baritone was the horizon, and Bonnie's soprano was the sky. Together they created a seamless, panoramic sound. Their first recording sessions as a trio were electric. A new dimension of musical possibility had opened up to them. Under Robison, they recorded a string of successful country hits. Here, Today, and Gone Tomorrow showcase their upbeat, rhythmic side, while a beautiful ballad called I Take the Chance soared to number 2 on the country charts. The song, a heartfelt pledge of devotion, became their biggest hit yet and their signature song of the Faber years. The sound was undeniable, and Nashville was beginning to take notice. The ultimate validation came in 1959. On the strength of I Take the Chance, they received the most sacred invitation in all of country music, a request to become members of the Grand Ole Opry. For a family who had grown up with their ears pressed to a wooden radio, listening to the Opry broadcast from a world away, this was the culmination of every dream they had ever dared to have. It was like being asked to join the pantheon of the gods. Their debut night at Nashville's historic Ryman Auditorium was a surreal, nerve-wracking, and glorious blur. The Ryman wasn't just a building, it was a church, the mother church of country music. The air backstage was thick with history, the wooden walls seemingly saturated with the echoes of every country legend who had ever stood on its stage. They walked past dressing rooms bearing the names of their heroes, Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb, Minnie Pearl. They were greeted by fellow performers not as newcomers, but as peers. Maxine remembered the overwhelming feeling of stepping out onto that hallowed stage for the first time. The stage was marked with circles worn into the wood by decades of performers tapping their feet in time with the music. The moment the spotlight hit them, a wave of terror and exhilaration washed over her. She looked out at the packed pews of the auditorium and saw the faces of people who loved this music as much as she did. Jim Ed stepped up to the microphone and introduced them. Then they sang. The moment their three voices joined in harmony, the Ryman's legendary acoustics embraced their sound, amplifying its purity and sending it soaring to the rafters. All the years of practice on the porch, all the miles on the road, all the struggles and heartaches, it all melted away. In that moment, they were no longer just the children of an Arkansas logger. They were members of the grand Ole Opry. They had arrived. The applause that rained down on them that night wasn't just for a good performance. It was a welcome home. They had reached the pinnacle of the country music world, but a new, even more dizzying ascent was about to begin. Stepping onto the stage of the Ryman Auditorium was the culmination of one dream, the arrival at a destination they had aimed for their entire lives. Membership in the Grand Ole Opry solidified their place in the heart of country music. Yet, even as they settled into the kingdom of tradition, a revolution was brewing on Music Row, a new sound for a new era. Their journey to the peak of the mountain was over, but a far higher, more glittering and dangerous summit, the world of international pop stardom, was now coming into view, and the man who held the map was Chet Atkins. Becoming members of the Grand Ole Opry in 1959 was, for the Brown siblings, like being granted citizenship in the country music kingdom. They had a home base, a place of artistic belonging, and the respect of their peers. Yet a gilded cage is still a cage. While their stars were rising in Nashville, they were still legally and financially tethered to Faber Robeson and his restrictive contract. Every hit song, every sold-out performance, and every dollar they earned was filtered through the complex and disadvantageous terms they had signed in a moment of youthful optimism. Maxine, whose innate business sense had been sharpened by years of hard-won experience, felt the chafe of this arrangement most acutely. She knew they were worth more. She knew their talent was being undervalued and their earnings siphoned away. The desire to break free from Robeson became an obsession. It was no simple matter. Their contract was legally binding, but their success had given them leverage, and their position at the Opry had put them in the orbit of some of Nashville's most powerful figures. One of those figures was Chet Atkins, a legendary guitarist and one of the most respected producers in music history. Atkins was the head of RCA Victor's Nashville division. He was a quiet, thoughtful man with an unparalleled ear for what made a song a hit. He had heard the Browns, and he recognized the rare, singular beauty of their harmony. He saw in them the perfect vessel for the new, sophisticated sound he was carefully crafting for country music. With the considerable influence of RCA and Chet Atkins behind them, the Browns began the arduous legal process of extracting themselves from their deal with Faber Records. It was a messy, protracted battle, a behind-the-scenes drama of lawyers and negotiations that stood in stark contrast to their serene public image. But in 1956, they succeeded. They were free. The moment they signed their new contract with RCA, Victor was a profound turning point. It wasn't just a better deal. It was an artistic liberation. They were leaving the minor leagues and stepping onto the main field, set to work with the master architect of modern country music. To walk into RCA's Studio B on Music Row in the mid-1950s was to enter the laboratory where the future of music was being invented. It was a cavernous, acoustically perfect room that would later become known as the home of 1,000 hits. This was where Elvis Presley, the Everly Brothers, and Jim Reeves were creating records that would define a generation. The atmosphere was one of quiet, focused professionalism. It was a world away from the makeshift recording setups and rush sessions they had experienced before. Here the producer was king, and the king was Chet Atkins. Atkins's vision was both revolutionary and controversial. He believed that for country music to survive the onslaught of rock and roll, it needed to evolve. It needed to shed its rural hillbilly image and appeal to a broader, more sophisticated, and increasingly suburban audience. This meant smoothing out the rough edges. He began to strip away the whining fiddles and twangy steel guitars that were the hallmarks of traditional honky-tonk music, replacing them with lush string sections, backing choruses, often provided by the peerless Jordanaires, and the subtle, elegant tick-tock of a rhythm section. This new style became known as the Nashville Sound, a polished country-politan blend that was as much pop as it was country. For traditionalists, it was heresy. For RCA, it was a commercial goldmine. And for the Browns, it was a perfect fit. Chet Atkins understood that their harmony was their most precious asset. His genius as a producer lay in his restraint. He knew not to overproduce them, but to create a clean, elegant sonic frame that would allow the natural beauty of their voices to shine. Their initial sessions at RCA produced a series of solid country hits, further cementing their status as Opry stars. But Atkins was searching for something truly extraordinary, a song that could launch them beyond the confines of the country charts and into the national consciousness. He found it in the most unlikely of places. In 1959, he brought them a song that had been a major hit in France for the legendary chanteuse Edith Piaf. It was called Les Trois Cloches, the Three Bells. In its original French, it was a dramatic, sweeping ballad. An English version had been written by American songwriter Dick Manning, transforming it into a folk-like narrative. The song told the simple, poignant life story of a fictional character, Little Jimmy Brown, through the eyes of the village that watched him grow. His story is marked by three pivotal life events: his birth, his wedding, and his funeral, each heralded by the ringing of the chapel bells. When Atkins first played the demo for them, their reaction was uncertain. It was a story song, long and narrative-driven, with a spoken word part. It didn't sound like anything else on the radio. It wasn't a love song. It wasn't a cheating song. And it certainly wasn't a honky-tonk stomper. It was more like a miniature novel set to music. But they trusted Chet. They went into Studio B to record it, and in that session, magic was made. The arrangement was a masterpiece of simplicity and taste. Atkins stripped it down to its bare essentials: a gently strummed acoustic guitar, the subtle evocative chime of bells, and the three voices. He made the brilliant decision to have Jim Ed deliver the narrative verses in a calm, almost spoken word style, his warm baritone acting as the town's storyteller. This gave the song an incredible intimacy, as if the listener were being told a personal story by a trusted friend. Then on the chorus, the sisters' voices would enter, swelling into a gorgeous, wordless harmony that acted as the song's emotional core, the collective voice of the village, the sound of the bells themselves expressing a joy and sorrow too deep for words. The recording session was meticulous. They did take after take, perfecting the phrasing, the dynamics, and the delicate interplay of their voices. When they listened to the final playback in the control room, a hush fell over the studio. They had captured lightning in a bottle. The recording was haunting, beautiful, and utterly unique. RCA released The Three Bells in the summer of 1959. What happened next was beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The song didn't just become a hit, it became a cultural phenomenon. It started on country radio, where it quickly shot to number 1. But then something unprecedented happened. Pop stations began to play it. In an era where musical genres were strictly segregated, The Three Bells shattered the barriers. The song's universal story of the human life cycle resonated with everyone. It climbed the Billboard Hot 100 pop chart, eventually staying at number 1 for 4 consecutive weeks. Then, in the most stunning crossover of all, it began to get airplay on R&B stations, reaching number 10 on that chart. The Browns were no longer just country stars. They were international pop sensations. The 3 siblings from the backwoods of Arkansas, who had once sung for pocket change at schoolhouse socials, now had the number 1 song in America. Their world was turned upside down overnight. They were booked on every major television program of the day. They stood on the stage of the Ed Sullivan Show, the same stage where the Beatles would make their American debut a few years later, and sang their gentle ballad for a television audience of tens of millions. They appeared on Dick Clark's American Bandstand, surrounded by teenagers dancing to a song about life and death. They were guests on the Perry Como Show and the Pat Boone Chevy Showroom. Their clean-cut, wholesome image, a perfect fit for the family-friendly variety shows of the era. The song's success was global. They embarked on major tours of Europe, playing to sold-out concert halls in England, Germany, and Scandinavia. They were greeted by audiences who didn't speak a word of English, but were moved to tears by the universal emotion in their harmonies. The money for the first time in their lives was flowing in. They could finally provide for their parents in a way they had only ever dreamed of, buying them a comfortable home and ensuring they would never have to worry about poverty again. Riding the massive wave of The Three Bells, they released 2 more crossover hits that further cemented their status. Scarlet Ribbons for Her Hair, another beautiful folk ballad, and a lushly orchestrated version of the 1940s classic The Old Lamplighter. Both became major pop and country hits. For a period of about 3 years, from 1959 to 1962, the Browns were at the absolute apex of the music world. They were the darlings of Nashville, the embodiment of the crossover success that the Nashville sound had promised. But the view from the mountaintop, while breathtaking, can also be precarious. The relentless pace of stardom began to take its toll. Their lives were a blur of tour buses, airplanes, hotel rooms, and stage lights. The constant travel was physically and emotionally draining, and the pressure to maintain their perfect image was immense. And within the tight-knit family unit, the first subtle hairline cracks began to appear. Bonnie, the youngest, had always been the most grounded. While she enjoyed the music, she had never been driven by the same burning ambition as Maxine. In 1960, she married the love of her life, a doctor named Gene Ring, a man who existed entirely outside the chaotic world of show business. Soon, they started a family. The conflict for Bonnie became acute. Every day on the road was a day away from her husband and her young children. The pull of a normal life of being a wife and mother grew stronger with each tour. The glamour of the spotlight began to pale in comparison to the simple joys of home. Jim Ed, meanwhile, was coming into his own as a performer. As the handsome, smooth-voiced frontman of the group, he naturally drew a great deal of attention. Record executives, agents, and publishers were constantly in his ear, suggesting that he had the potential for a massive solo career. They told him he could be the next Jim Reeves or Eddie Arnold. While he loved singing with his sisters, the seed of a solo ambition had been planted. He began to wonder what he could achieve on his own, separate from the family identity. And then there was Maxine. For her, the Browns was not a stepping stone or a temporary chapter. It was her life's work. She had willed the group into existence through sheer force of will. She had managed them, written for them, and fought for them. She saw what they had built not as three separate careers, but as a single, sacred entity. She saw her siblings' diverging desires with a growing sense of panic. She tried to be the mediator, the peacemaker, the one who reminded them of their shared history and their incredible journey. She tried to hold the three fragile threads of their lives together, but she could feel them beginning to pull apart. The harmony, so effortless on stage, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain behind the scenes. They were at the height of their fame, the toast of the music world, but a quiet, heartbreaking countdown had already begun. From the outside, the Browns were a perfect constellation, 3 stars shining in flawless alignment at the zenith of the music world. But the immense gravity of their fame was also a crushing pressure, pulling at the fragile human connections that held them together. While their voices on vinyl remained eternally in sync, their lives off stage were beginning to drift apart, charting courses toward different futures. The beautiful, seamless sound the world had fallen in love with was becoming a performance of a unity that no longer existed, and the final heartbreaking notes were fast approaching. The years following their pop superstardom, from roughly 1963 to 1967, were a period of graceful, slow descent for the Browns. They were no longer dominating the charts or appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show, but they remained highly respected and consistently successful members of the country music establishment. They continued to record for RCA, producing a string of top 20 country hits, and their performances at the Grand Ole Opry were always a highlight. To the outside world, they were a model of stability, their harmonies as pristine as ever, their family bond seemingly unbreakable. But behind the velvet curtain of their perfect sound, the private, individual lives of the 3 siblings were diverging at an accelerating pace. The centrifugal force of their own personal dreams was beginning to overwhelm the gravity that had held them together for so long. The road, which had once been a ribbon of adventure leading them to their destiny, had become a treadmill of exhausting obligations. For Bonnie, the conflict was the most acute and visible. She was now the mother of 2 young daughters, and her heart was no longer on the tour bus. It was at home in Arkansas. The life of a touring musician is fundamentally incompatible with the rhythms of traditional motherhood. She was plagued by a constant gnawing guilt. When she was on the road, she was missing her children's first steps, their first words, the simple, irreplaceable moments of their childhood. When she was at home on a rare break, the looming shadow of the next tour date prevented her from ever feeling truly settled. She would perform on stage, smiling and singing beautifully, while her mind was 1,000 miles away, worrying about a sick child or a missed school event. The joy of performing had been replaced by the ache of sacrifice, and it was becoming an unbearable burden. Jim Ed, meanwhile, was facing a different kind of pull. His solo ambitions, once a quiet curiosity, were now being actively cultivated by RCA. The label saw him as a bankable star in his own right, a handsome and charismatic performer with a voice that could carry a show. In 1965, with the group's blessing, he began releasing solo singles while still performing with his sisters. His first efforts were moderately successful. The following year, his single Papa Top was a smash, climbing to number 3 on the country charts and becoming one of his signature songs. His solo success created a strange and unsustainable duality. He was, in effect, leading 2 separate careers. He would perform a set with his sisters, then later in the same show, he would perform his own solo material. The applause for his solo hits was thunderous, a clear indication of his individual star power. For Maxine, standing in the wings, watching her brother command the stage alone, the feeling must have been a complex cocktail of pride and dread. She was immensely proud of the man and the artist he had become, but every roar of the crowd for Jim Brown, solo star, felt like a shovelful of earth on the grave of the trio she had dedicated her life to. Maxine was the keeper of the flame, the one who fought against the inevitable twilight. She saw the writing on the wall, and it terrified her. She tried everything she could to keep the group viable and interesting to her siblings. She suggested they cut back on their touring schedule, performing only on weekends or at the Opry. She searched tirelessly for new material, hoping that the perfect song might reignite the spark they once shared. But she was fighting against the powerful, natural currents of life itself, a mother's love for her children, and a young man's desire to forge his own identity. It was a battle she could not win. The harmony on stage was still perfect, a feat of muscle memory and professionalism, but the harmony in their souls was gone. The end, when it finally came, was not a fiery explosion, but a quiet, clinical decision. In 1967, the group was booked for a series of shows in Lake Tahoe. The glamour of the location stood in stark contrast to the grim finality of the conversation that took place in a hotel room. Jim Ed and Bonnie sat Maxine down and told her, gently but firmly, tersation that took place in a hotel room. Jim Ed and Bonnie sat Maxine down and told her, gently but firmly, that they were done. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an announcement. They planned to honor the rest of their contracted dates, and then the Browns would be officially retired. For them, it was a logical, even responsible conclusion. They wanted to end at the top of their game, to leave the audience with the memory of their perfect harmony intact, rather than letting the group wither away through resentment and exhaustion. For Maxine, the words were like a physical blow. The world tilted on its axis. In her autobiography, she describes the moment with a raw, visceral sense of shock and betrayal. This wasn't just her job ending. It was her life's purpose being dismantled before her eyes. I wasn't ready to quit, she would later write. I was just hitting my stride. This single sentence encapsulates the tragedy of her position. At 36 years old, she was a seasoned, confident performer at the peak of her powers, but her career was inextricably linked to 2 people who were ready to walk away. She pleaded with them, her voice cracking with an emotion she never allowed on stage. She begged them to reconsider, or at the very least to do a proper farewell tour to thank the fans who had supported them for over a decade. But their minds were made up. The decision was final. Their last few performances were surreal. They sang their beautiful songs of love and life, their voices blending as seamlessly as ever, all while carrying the secret knowledge that it was over. Their final official performance as members of the Grand Ole Opry was a particularly poignant and heartbreaking affair. They stood on the sacred circle of wood on the Ryman stage, the place that had signified their ultimate arrival, and sang for the last time as a group. As they sang the closing lines of one of their hits, the harmonies hanging in the air for a final perfect moment, Maxine looked out at the audience through a blur of tears. The applause was warm and loving, but for her, It sounded like a eulogy. In the immediate aftermath of the breakup, the diverging paths of the three siblings became starkly clear. Bonnie retired from the music business without a single backward glance. She joyfully embraced the life she had craved for so long, becoming a full-time wife, mother, and an active member of her Arkansas community. Her story had its happy ending. Jim Ed's solo career exploded. Freed from the trio format, he was heavily promoted by RCA. He followed Papa Top with a string of hits, and later in the mid-1970s became a popular co-host of the television show Nashville on the Road, and later formed a hugely successful duo with Helen Cornelius. He remained a beloved and respected member of the Grand Ole Opry for the rest of his life. His story, too, had its happy ending, and Maxine was left standing alone in the deafening silence. The industry that had celebrated her as 1/3 of a perfect sound suddenly had no idea what to do with her. She was 36 years old, a veteran with a famous name, but in the ruthless calculus of the music business of the late 1960s, she was a commercial risk. She was not a fresh-faced ingenue, nor was she a powerhouse vocalist in the mold of a Patsy Cline or a Brenda Lee. Her artistry was more subtle, woven into the fabric of harmony and collaboration. She tried. With the support of Chet Atkins, she recorded several solo singles for RCA Victor, but they failed to gain any traction. The songs were good, her voice was true, but they failed to gain any traction. Radio programmers didn't know how to categorize her. The public, who knew her only as one of the Browns, seemed unable to accept her as a solo artist. Her records vanished without a trace. It was a cruel and swift lesson in the fickle nature of fame. The phone, which had once rung off the hook with offers, fell silent. The invitations to the industry parties and award shows dried up. She was an outsider in a town where she had once been royalty. The professional rejection was devastating, but the personal and emotional toll was even deeper. She was haunted by a profound sense of abandonment. She had to watch as her younger brother's career soared, a constant, painful reminder of the success she felt she should have been sharing. It was a complex and agonizing emotional position to be in. She loved her brother and was deeply proud of him, but his every hit record felt like a confirmation of her own failure. She was profoundly lonely. For her entire adult life, she had been part of a unit. She had traveled, performed, and lived in the constant company of her siblings. Now, she was on her own. The silence in her house was a palpable presence. She wrote in her book about the bittersweet pain of hearing one of their old songs come on the radio. The familiar sound of their three voices, so perfectly intertwined, would transport her back to a time of shared purpose and glory, and the wave of grief and loss would be overwhelming. It was the sound of a family that was still whole, a dream that was still alive. It was the sound of everything she had lost. Refusing to be defeated, she tried to find other ways to stay in the business she loved. She worked for a time as a booking agent and in music publishing. But these behind-the-scenes roles were a constant torment. She was now the person making the phone calls for other artists, booking the gigs she used to play, a ghost in the machinery of the industry she had helped to build. Every day was a reminder of her changed status. She was no longer Maxine Brown of the Browns. She was just Maxine Brown, a woman with a famous past trying to find her place in a world that had moved on without her. She was mourning not just a career, but an identity. And the long, arduous process of figuring out who she was without the harmony had just begun. The silence that followed the end of the Browns was more than just the absence of music. It was the absence of an identity. For years, Maxine existed in this quiet aftermath, a living memory of a bygone era. A lesser spirit might have been consumed by the shadows of bitterness and regret, fading completely from view. But the same resilience that had carried her family out of poverty was still there, a pilot light waiting for a purpose. Her singing voice had been silenced by the industry, but another, more powerful voice, that of the witness, the historian, and the truth-teller, was about to emerge, ready to tell the story no one else could. For many years after the breakup of the Browns, Maxine's life was defined by a profound and jarring quiet. The roar of the crowd had been replaced by the hum of ordinary life, the intricate harmonies on stage replaced by the solitary melody of her own thoughts. She existed in a kind of cultural limbo, a name people remembered but a person they no longer saw. She watched the Nashville she had helped build evolve from a distance, a ghost at the feast of its own success. For many people, this would have been the end of the story, a gentle fade into the footnotes of music history. But Maxine Brown was forged in the resilient earth of Arkansas, and her story had one final powerful act left to be written. The turning point came not with a new song, but with a new kind of voice. In the decades that followed her career, she became the keeper of the memories. She carefully preserved the photographs, the newspaper clippings, the awards, and the stories that comprised the history of the Browns. She realized that the official narrative of country music, so focused on the larger-than-life solo stars, was in danger of forgetting the nuances of their story. The world remembered the three bells, but it was forgetting the struggle, the exploitation, the family dynamics, and the quiet sister who had been the group's engine. She came to a powerful realization. If the true story was to be told, she would have to be the one to tell it. The decision to write her autobiography was an act of profound self-reclamation. For years, her identity had been defined by others, as one-third of a trio, as Jimed's sister, as a forgotten artist. By picking up a pen, she was seizing control of her own narrative for the first time in her life. The result, published in 2005, was Looking Back to See, a country music memoir. The book was a revelation. It was not the glossy, sanitized celebrity memoir that was common in the genre. It was a work of startling honesty, emotional depth, and historical importance. In its pages, she laid bare the unvarnished truth of their journey. She wrote with love and warmth about their impoverished but music-filled childhood, painting a vivid picture of the world that had shaped them. But she did not shy away from the darkness. She detailed with the clarity of hard-won wisdom the predatory nature of their first contract with Faber-Robeson, providing a chilling first-hand account of the systemic exploitation that was rampant in the early days of the music industry. Her story became a crucial piece of testimony, giving voice to the countless young artists who had been similarly victimized. Most powerfully, she wrote about the breakup and its aftermath with a candor that was both heartbreaking and deeply healing. She articulated the crushing sense of betrayal and abandonment she felt, the loneliness of being left behind while her siblings moved on to new lives. Yet, her account was conspicuously free of malice. She wrote of her love for Jimed and Bonnie with a deep, unshakable sincerity. Her book was not an act of revenge, but an act of understanding, an attempt to make peace with the most painful chapter of her life by finally telling its truth. In writing her story, she found a new purpose. She was no longer just the keeper of the harmony. She had become its most important historian. Her memoir allows us to look back at their career with a sharper, more critical lens. The controversy of the Nashville sound, for instance, takes on a new dimension through her eyes. While purists lamented the loss of fiddles and steel guitars, Maxine's story reminds us what that sound meant for the artists. For a family that had known true poverty, The commercial success of the Nashville sound was not a sellout. It was a salvation. It was the sound of financial security, of a new roof over their parents' heads, of a life they could never have imagined. The Browns' music, in this context, becomes a testament to the genre's ability to evolve without losing its storytelling soul. They proved that sophistication and authenticity were not mutually exclusive. Maxine's story also forces a confrontation with the institutional sexism of the era. Her inability to launch a solo career was not a simple failure. It was a symptom of a deeply biased industry. In the 1960s, Nashville had clearly defined and very limited roles for its female stars. You could be the sassy girl singer in a man's band, the wholesome sweetheart, or the fiery, truth-telling honky-tonk angel like Loretta Lynn. There was no established lane for a woman in her late 30s, known for her subtle harmony work, to rebrand herself as a solo artist. Maxine's talent was never in question, but she didn't fit into any of the predetermined boxes. Her quiet sidelining stands as a powerful indictment of a system that often valued packaging over artistry and youth over experience. The ultimate significance of the Browns, and Maxine's role within the group, is a legacy of quiet but profound influence. Their seamless blood harmony became a benchmark, a standard of excellence that future generations would aspire to. When Loretta Lynn famously said, "Nobody could sing like the Browns," she was speaking for countless musicians who recognized the rare and inimitable quality of their blend. Their sound echoed in the tight harmonies of the Everly Brothers, the folk revival groups of the 60s, and in the family bands that would become a staple of country music. From the Statler Brothers to Alabama, they helped to elevate vocal harmony from a mere accompaniment to the central feature of a song, and their music has endured. The Three Bells remains a timeless piece of musical storytelling, a song so universal it has been used in films and television shows like The Sopranos and Goodfellas to evoke a sense of sweeping, epic nostalgia. It stands as a monument to their ability to capture the entirety of the human experience in a single three-verse ballad. In her later years, Maxine settled into a life of quiet contentment, her peace made with the past. The Browns would reunite on rare special occasions, for an Opry anniversary or a television special. When they sang together even in their senior years, the old magic would flicker back to life. The intuitive blend was still there, a musical muscle memory forged in childhood that time could not erase. These moments were bittersweet, a beautiful glimpse of what once was. Her book had healed many of the old wounds, replacing ambiguity and hurt with understanding. In June of 2015, Jim Ed Brown passed away from cancer. The following July, in 2016, Bonnie also succumbed to the disease. The two younger siblings, who had walked away from the spotlight together, also left the world in close succession. Suddenly, Maxine was the last one left, the sole surviving member of the trio, the final keeper of the flame. She carried the weight of their shared history alone for the last few years of her life, before passing away herself in January 2019 at the age of 87. When we look back at the life of Maxine Brown, it is a story of three distinct harmonies. First, there was the sublime musical harmony she created with her siblings, a sound so perfect it seemed to defy the friction and messiness of human life. Second, there was the complex and often strained harmony of family, the struggle to balance individual dreams with collective responsibility, a harmony that ultimately could not be sustained. But the final, and perhaps most important harmony, is the one Maxine found within herself. It was a harmony born not of blending in, but of standing alone. It was the harmony of a woman who faced down the silence, the rejection, and the erasure, and answered it not with bitterness, but with the clear, powerful voice of her own truth. She lost a career, but in doing so, she found her story and gave it to the world as her final lasting gift. Maxine Brown was not the star who burned the brightest. She was the steady, constant light that allowed the others to shine. She was the anchor in a beautiful song, and when the music ended, she became the anchor of its memory. She held the harmony together for as long as she could, and when it was gone, she ensured that its echo and her own essential place within it would never, ever fade away.